Hello, Willard Wildcats. Today, I want us to think about some very important structures in our bodies, our organs. We have different systems in our body that work together to help us survive. But there's one system that we're going to be thinking about today that you have been using every moment of today, and you don't even think about it. Today, I'm thinking about your respiratory system. And you know what your respiratory system makes me think of? That's right, broccoli. Don't worry, we'll get there. So, your respiratory system contains your lungs. How does air get into your lungs? So, when you breathe in, air enters your body and it goes down into your lungs. So you breathe in through your nose and through your mouth, and air goes into a tube, and that tube goes down your throat. Now, what is this tube called? Is that your esophagus? No, that's a different tube. That's how food reaches your stomach. Air enters your body through this tube in your throat. It sits right next to your esophagus. You might have heard it called your windpipe. Scientists call it your trachea. So your trachea is how air gets down into your lungs. Now, when you breathe in, air travels in through your trachea. When you breathe out, air travels out of your lungs and back up out of your trachea. But what are your lungs? Are they just two big sacs down inside your body? Well, no. This trachea splits into two. It splits into two tubes. One, two. And those two tubes are called the bronchi. The two bronchi, each one of them leads to one of your lungs. So here, so a big lung here, and a big lung here. So the bronchi split, and they keep splitting into smaller and smaller tubes inside your lungs. So these bronchi split into smaller tubes, and those split into smaller tubes, and so on, until your lungs, they just keep splitting down into smaller and smaller, tiny little tubes. And these smaller tubes are called your bronchioles. Those bronchioles, they split down, they branch, they get smaller and smaller until each one ends in a tiny little air sac. And your lungs are full of these tiny, microscopic little sacs of air. That's what your lungs are made up of. And those little tiny sacs are called the alveoli. And the same thing's happening in the other lung as well. So, you breathe in through your mouth and your nose. The air travels down through your trachea. The trachea splits into two bronchi. The bronchi split into a whole bunch of brachioles, and the brachioles end in these little tiny alveoli. All right? And this is why your lungs are like a piece of broccoli. Take a stalk of broccoli and now turn it upside down. There's one stem, like the trachea, and then the stem splits into smaller and smaller stems, like the bronchi or the bronchioles. And then they keep splitting and splitting until you get down to these tiny green bumps. Each tiny bump is like one of the alveoli. The structure of your lungs is a lot like a piece of broccoli. So that is how your lungs are structured But how do you actually breathe? Your lungs are not made of muscle, and so you need a muscle to help you to breathe. You have a muscle right under your lungs called your diaphragm. It pulls down on your lungs to stretch them open, and that makes air go in to your mouth, into your lungs. And they push up on your lungs when you breathe out. So let's try that. So make your diaphragm go down and breathe in. And then push it out. Now, that's pretty interesting and all, but your lungs are deep inside you. You can't see them to see how they work. Well, that's okay, because I have some lung specimens that we can take a closer look at. I am wearing gloves to handle the preserved lungs, not because they're dirty or dangerous, but because I don't want to get any germs or dirt on them. They have been in the science room for a long time, and they're very fragile, so I have to be very careful with them. Now, these are not a person's lungs. These are sheep lungs. They came from a sheep a long time ago. Right after the animal died, the lungs were filled with a chemical that made the tissue get very hard. It got hard and dried out, and now we can see what the full lungs of the sheep looked like. Were the lungs in the sheep like this? No. Sheep stand on all four legs. Our rib cage runs up and down. Theirs runs side to side. So the lungs were like this in the animal. Now, if the lungs were like this, here's a tube. If the lungs were like this, which way was the sheep facing? That way or that way? Well, this is the trachea, you see? And the trachea leads to the mouth and the nose, so the animal would have been facing that way. Now look at the shape of the lungs. They're very smooth on the outside. This surface here at the bottom, this smooth surface here, that's where the diaphragm was. The muscle attached here pulled the lungs open and then pushed them to empty them of air. There's an opening right about here, right about the size of my fist. What do you think used to be here? This is where the sheep's heart was. The lungs were on either side of the heart. Just like our lungs are on either side of our heart. Our lungs are very important for getting oxygen into our blood and getting carbon dioxide out. So it makes sense that the lungs and the heart would be so close to each other. You can even see how many blood vessels used to be in this space. They aren't here anymore. The blood vessels aren't here anymore. These lines are just the empty spaces where the blood vessels used to be. Now, let's look at the tube that leads into the lungs. It's right here. It's very hard right now. Now, do you remember what this tube is called? It's called the trachea. That's right. Now you can just see where the trachea splits into the two bronchi, but you can't see the bronchioles splitting into smaller and smaller tubes. We can't see the alveoli. All that is inside the lung tissue. We can't see into this lung tissue, but I happen to have another piece of a lung. This is a piece cut out of a preserved lung, like this one. See, here's the smooth edge, but because it's been cut, now we can see inside the lung. It's not solid like a piece of meat or muscle. It's full of tiny holes. Some of these holes are the alveoli, the little pockets of air. Some of them are tiny tubes, the tiny bronchioles leading to the alveoli.
These lungs will never breathe again. The soft, stretchy tissue has been made hard. The lungs can't stretch and fill. They can't empty anymore. But I do have another lung sample that has not been hardened. Let's take a look at it.
These lungs are also sheep lungs. Can you see how small they are compared to the other lungs? Why are they so small if they are also sheep lungs? Well, these are totally empty. There's no air in them at all. Now they're also a different color. Why are these lungs so dark? Well, these lungs breathed in a lot of smoke and a lot of pollution while the animal was alive. When a person or an animal breathes in a lot of smoke or pollution, those particles can get stuck inside the lungs. Over a long time, with a lot of smoke and a lot of pollution, the lungs start to get discolored and darker. The particles that get stuck inside can block off some of the alveoli. They can block off the bronchioles. It can make it hard to get enough air to your lungs if you're a heavy smoker, or if you live for many years in a place with really bad pollution. You can develop different lung diseases when those particles build up in your lungs. It's important to take care of your lungs just like you take care of the other parts of your body by breathing in clean, fresh air as much as possible. Now, I can get air into these lungs. I just have to attach them to these pipes and then pump some air into them. So I have it all set up now. The lungs are attached to the pipes. The pipes are hollow and they're connected through this tube to a foot pump. So now I have to push on this several times. Okay. I have to push several pumps to start to fill the lungs with air. Can you see the air going into the lungs? And as soon as I stop, they shrink back down. The air goes out of them as soon as I stop. So your lungs are made of this very stretchy tissue. You need a muscle, your diaphragm, to pull down on the lungs so that they can open up and pull in air. I hope I was able to spark your curiosity and that I was able to answer some of your questions by showing you my different lung samples. I wish I could have shown these to you in person here in the science room. It is always an exciting day when I get to inflate the lungs right in front of you. Now, take good care of your lungs, just like you take good care of the rest of your body, so that you can have clean, healthy lungs throughout your life.
Now that you've reached the end of the video, click the little white arrow on the blue background here to continue on to the last part of the Nearpod.